Welcome to Untapped, Knowledge for College, presented by the College Knowledge Foundation. Join us as we untap the world of college admissions, financial aid, and student life through collective wisdom and engaging conversations.
Welcome to Untapped Knowledge for College. I'm your host, Donovan Lindsay, and today we're diving into one of the most important topics when it comes to making your decision for college, and that's going to be financial aid packages. When you start getting your acceptance letters, you receive financial aid offers from schools, but understanding what's in those packages isn't always as straightforward as you might think it might be. What does the total cost actually include? How does it compare to other offers from different schools that you have been accepted to? What should you be looking for to make the best financial aid or financial decision for you and your family? To help us break this down, I'm excited to welcome back to the podcast Nick Tomaskovic, who is here to help us navigate financial aid packages. Last time he was here to talk about just financial aid in general, but I had to have him back because this time of year, this is very, very important. So he's going to help us kind of look at what they entail, how to interpret them, and what students and families need to keep in mind when they are making their final college decisions. Nick, welcome back. Thanks so much for being back and being here on the podcast.
Donovan, thank you so much for having me. Good to be back, and you do good work. I'm glad to be part of it.
Yeah, I was excited that you. I know that the last time you was like, yeah, have me back as much as you want. And I was like, be careful what you wish for because I think that there's so many topics that you could cover. I know last time we did talk about so much of the financial aid basics, but I'd like to talk about a little more of the financial aid basics before we really get into breaking down the financial aid packages. So, can you just explain for our listeners right now? What is financial aid and why would you say it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great place to start. Kind of go back to the basics and then take a deeper dive from there. What is financial aid? And in this sense, in the world of higher education, in the world of colleges and universities and students attending those institutions, financial aid is just that. It's a form of aid. It's actually multiple forms of aid that help students pay for their education. Um, Plain and simple. Help students pay for college. It could take the many forms. It could look different for everyone. So that's something I think is important, and I know we always stress is that financial aid is unique just to students because students are unique and their situations are all different. So
Hmm.
typically, financial aid can you'll find basic categories. So, for instance, the four main categories of financial aid commonly associated with higher education are scholarships, grants, loans, and federal work study. So, we could talk a little bit more about what those are. Some are going to be purely academic and merit based. They're going to reward students for doing well in high school and for being good candidates to the college or university. And some are going to be need based. So what that means, Donovan, is there's going to be a financial need component to the financial aid, which comes from the students and oftentimes the families. Financial situation. So again, going to be unique to the student and the situation.
So I know one of the ways to get considered for financial aid is submitting the FAFSA form. So can you talk just a little bit about kind of what the FAFSA is, and how does that kind of determine for a lot of people how much aid they could potentially get?
Absolutely, Donovan. So the FAFSA, and I know a lot of our listeners have heard this, like many words or concepts in higher education. FAFSA is an acronym. We do love our acronyms. FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And it is free, as the name suggests. It's free, it's online, it's for students and their families who are now referred to as contributors. So this is a newer term that has emerged in the last year or so in the financial aid and admissions landscape. They complete during the process. So it takes a look at earnings. It takes a look at income-based documents, so W-2s, any kind of savings, investments, things of that nature, that the Department of Education, along with individual states and obviously institutions of higher learning, use to create financial aid packages, or offers for students, which obviously inform and help guide their decision on which school to ultimately attend. So sometimes it's called different things.
Hmm.
We'll use the words or the terms, financial aid packages, financial aid awards, or even financial aid, um, aid summaries. So the terms and the vernacular will change a little bit, but honestly, Donovan, they all mean the same thing. They're all referring to
Sure.
the types of forms, whether federal, state, or coming from the school, that will help a student.
In your experience, would you say that there are any type of common misconceptions when it comes to financial aid by students and or their parents or supporters?
Common misconception. That is a good question. Just because you can answer that in so many different ways. So I'll answer it this way, and I'll tell you what I hear a lot from students, and even more so from their parents, right? Their
Sure.
contributors, is that, I'm not, I know the FAFSA exists, and I know that everybody is encouraging me to fill it out. But I don't think I'm going to, because I simply don't feel that I make the right number. And I'm using,
Yeah.
right here in the, in an air quote sense. I don't make, or I make too much money, or I don't make a right amount
Hmm.
of money to qualify my student, my son, my daughter, my student for financial aid. And
Hmm.
I think there is a shred, like most things, there's a grain of truth in that. And a lot of forms of need-based financial aid are going to take income into consideration, earnings, that sort of thing. If a student has parents, or if the student themselves is making beyond a certain threshold that the government or the school or both deems, um, in a less needy category, then yeah, absolutely, a student could be prevented from getting the full range of financial aid. They'll never know that, though, unless they fill out the FAFSA. And
Yeah.
that's why especially relevant this last year or so, because of the fact that the FAFSA has undergone a massive overhaul, the biggest overhaul within the last almost 40 years in federal, student aid history, happened last year. So that's something that I would encourage students and families to consider, as well as what was previously true might not
Hmm.
be that true anymore. So a lot of the reporting thresholds have changed, the thresholds for a lot of the need-based aid. So in terms of, so there's a category of aid, Donovan, which is, it's based on need. It's students would be eligible for what's called a Pell Grant. Okay.
Hmm.
And the Pell Grant, basically, the threshold for that increased. So what does that mean? It means more students are qualifying for that form of financial aid that they weren't, quite frankly, 2, 3 years ago. So I always encourage students and their families to take the time, fill out the FAFSA. In most instances, it takes less than a half an hour, to complete. And the benefits of knowing everything that you have access to in terms of financial aid,
Yeah.
far outweigh what I think that perception might be. Um, yeah,
I think one of the interesting things that you said, which I think more and more now, this is probably something that happens, whereas I never really thought about this or thought about it from the student's perspective as to how much they make. But I know talking with a lot of students now, doing what I do with college knowledge, there are lots of students who've got their own businesses, or students like there are all these different ways of income that they're getting now. And I really have always myself thought about it from the parent or guardian's perspective, not so much the student actually making so much money where they're not going to get the full range of aid that they potentially could get. So that yeah, that you
yeah,
just opened my eyes to something there.
yeah, and so that's a great point. I don't want to discourage students who either work part-time jobs or multiple part-time jobs, as an
Yeah.
increasing number of students, that I work with are. I don't want to suggest that in doing so they disqualify themselves, because oftentimes that threshold is beyond what they're making, and so
Yeah.
if they feel um, uneasy about reporting that, or that they're putting themselves at a disadvantage. Um, and there are always exceptions, but without talking, or in talking to most students, that fear is quite frankly, unjustified. But by and large, yeah, more often than not, it's the parent or parent whose income is going to be, more closely uh, scrutinized, if you will, just
Yeah.
because most times students aren't making that much money.
So would you say that there, for any student listening or parent listening, is there really a harm in submitting the FAFSA?
No, I wouldn't say there's a harm. In fact, I would say that there's more pros to cons, and something
Hmm.
I see all the time. I'll give you a very specific example, Donovan. Um, Students that come into our office various times throughout the semester, usually as the semester starts, or somewhere in the middle, a couple weeks in, and they're looking for a job, right? They want a work study job, and they know what a work study job is, or they think they know what a work study job is, but um, federal work study, quite simply, is just funds that have been allocated by the school um, to provide assistance, that additional category of assistance to students. Um, and I'll spare you the whole details, but basically every institution has a certain amount of funds that are earmarked
Hmm.
for the federal work study purpose. Some schools have a smaller pot than others, which is something that's important. So when you say, okay, this school has X number of students, and they have X number of students that they qualify for work study, is that a guarantee versus, this is on my financial aid package. The federal government says I qualify for financial aid for federal work study. Does that mean I automatically am getting a job? So there are these kinds of like nuances. But anyway, for the sake of argument, the most colleges and universities have a certain amount of money in their pot that are earmarked for federal work study. If you do not fill out the FAFSA, you're not eligible for work study. So and that's I think an incentive for a lot of students right there. Um, there's that extra money that they can tap into simply by submitting the FAFSA
Yeah.
that they would pass on otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's financial eligibility in terms of the FAFSA is directly tied to that. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I used to tell families all the time, I'm like, there's really not a harm. I mean, you may not get what you think you're going to get, but it opens up the door so much to more financial aid. And at times too, circumstances could change where
yeah,
you may want to have
absolutely.
one on file to maybe edit it later on. And I think specifically about like just the pandemic alone, like so many people losing their jobs during
Yeah,
that time, and how, kind of almost having to backtrack and like maybe, well, now I need to submit it because families lost all their income, or one parent has lost income, or the single parent has lost it. So yeah, there's so
yeah.
many things where I would say, I used to tell people all the time, submit it. The worst that can happen is you don't get anything. The best that can happen is you get something.
Absolutely. And life happens all the time, right? I mean, you talked about, or you provided some examples of things that I regrettably, am exposed to in my role. I see that on a,
Sure.
a weekly basis, Donovan, right? So
Hmm.
you have a loss of income, you have um, fire, a
Yeah.
flood, a natural disaster
Yeah, an
that,
infinite amount of
obviously nobody
things.
expects coming, right? Nobody expects a death of a parent, or
Hmm.
for that dependency situation to change. Maybe you move out of state, and you're attending a public-based institution. That's going to mean you're bumped into a different financial aid bracket, right? You're bumped into a
Sure.
different tuition bracket. So having that FAFSA on file can kind of be a safeguard against that, because
Yeah,
if you submitted that, the school has that information, and they can work with you a lot quicker, and more
correct.
effectively, basically, is what that comes down to. It just makes it easier for you as a student, because as a student, you have a myriad number of things that you're focusing on. You're focusing on
Yeah.
class, being a student first and foremost, but you also have a part-time job, and maybe you're responsible for getting yourself to class. So you have a vehicle, and that comes along with, various upkeep, costs that
Hmm.
go along with that. So there's a lot of things that go into that, vying for your attention. So And that's something that I would also say, which kind of leads into, um, know who can help you in those types of situations. You
Hmm.
even if you're the most brilliant person in the world and you are doing everything, you perceive you're doing pretty much everything right and you're doing it by yourself. There's a lot of other people that are part of that to are part of that equation that helped get you where you are today, right?
For
If that
sure.
makes sense. So there are a lot of
Yeah.
people in college that are resources, and there are a lot of people that also have a hand in being able to help you. So
Hmm.
knowing what you can do to get help, um, go to your financial aid office, start with your admission office, and go from there. Talk to others. Faculty are generally very knowledgeable and they are always, they're going to want to help you. So being able to tap into the resources that are already accessible to you, I think is something that is that's a best practice regardless of who you are.
Yeah, that's huge because I used to joke all the time when a parent or student would call me and I'd be sitting in my office and they'd ask me, they'd be two or three questions in, and they're asking another question. I'm on the phone with them, and they're like, "Oh, I apologize. I've got one more question." And they're like, "I got one more question.
Yeah.
Sorry to bother you."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "If you didn't have these questions, I wouldn't have a job." I'm like,
I
"You
wouldn't
ask all the
exactly.
questions that you want because this is
Yeah.
why I'm here." So like, take advantage of those resources. Like that's such a crucial tip because literally that's why they're there. But I used
Yeah.
to laugh like,
Abs
"This is my
100%.
job."
100%. Yeah, and I find and as you found, most people are really good people and they want to help. Um, so
Correct. Yeah.
asking, I don't think asking, knowing what to ask is as important as asking that first question.
Hmm. For sure.
Because financial aid and understanding financial aid is complicated, and it's not something that I'm going to guess that most of our listeners just naturally get or have picked up or um, know all that much about. To be very honest with you, and that's why we're talking about this very important topic today, because what students do and the amount of financial aid they do or don't get from a certain school or schools dramatically can alter the trajectory of their life, right? Let alone their career. But I mean, if you really think about what goes into a financial aid package, and by the some upperclassmen, some students who are a little savvier will eventually they'll know what to ask and they'll become familiar enough.
Yeah.
And then when you see them the next year and they come into your office and they say, "Well, I already did this step, X, Y, and Z," and you're like, "Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Remember that from last year, and I'm really happy that you're taking this knowledge and you're applying it."
Hmm.
And also, yeah, just it goes into the whole being an educated consumer concept, and that's what I always try to have a conversation with any student and family that I'm working with is, really underlying or stressing that point is that, your college is a good, education is a good. And while I, happen to think it's a public good, at the end of the day, it truly, it's not an inexpensive good. So that's something that you want to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, I mean, so far, great information. So like to do all that, to then get the actual financial aid package or financial aid summary. So when a student's getting that, kind of explain what exactly that is and kind of how should a student, what would be on it and how should a student kind of interpret that financial aid package once they receive that from a school?
Yeah, and so I'll start by saying, just like every student is different, every college and university is different. Every financial aid office at the college and university is also going to look a little different. There are some things that are going to stay the same. There are some things that are going to be constant, whether regardless of where a student is going. So,
Hmm.
for instance, a financial aid package is typically going to have a couple main components. It's going to have a breakdown of the cost, and cost here is usually going to refer to tuition. Tuition is quite literally what the um, monetary value is for going to class, right? It's the price of learning, so to speak.
Hmm.
So that's the tuition. And tuition is usually, you know, depending on the school and depending on the package, tuition will be broken into a year number, and then some schools will break it down into a semester. And a lot of schools will show you what your costs are per semester, and then for the overall year as well. So you can kind of break that down and you can see um, in those terms. So it's going to have tuition. It's going to have a room and board. So we call that, and these are kind of a little older terms. So some students, but most times you say room and board, and students know what you mean. But
Hmm.
that's your housing. So whether you're living on campus in university housing, or whether you're living off campus in university housing, or affiliated housing, and then your meal plan, right? Because everybody has to eat, everybody has to sleep, everybody has to eat. So there
Hmm.
are costs that are going to be associated with those. Um, those are going to usually be listed above any type of financial aid awards. And then we kind of start the subtraction process from there. So going down the list, you could see tuition, room, board, basically the costs of a school. Before any type of financial aid, then you would see financial aid listed as a line item. So that could be, again, those four categories: scholarships, grants, loans, work study, depending on what the school thinks you're eligible for, with the FAFSA. And then also, if the school has any merit-based scholarships that you qualify for, a lot of times schools are going to look at students' grades, their GPA, the strength of their schedule, what they've done outside the classroom is oftentimes taken into consideration. You know,
Hmm.
are you a well-rounded applicant? Are you a student leader? Are you somebody who leads inside the classroom? Are you an athlete? Do you show leadership on the field? Are you into community service? All these sorts of things. And some schools have scholarships just for community service and just for being involved in a club or organization or showing
Sure.
leadership qualities. So these are things that certainly can help some of our listeners, if they know that a school that they're applying to values these things, or if there's, uh, just ask, you know, do you
Hmm.
have merit-based scholarships? Do you have scholarships that were grants that are looking at other things outside of academics? You know, so we generally break financial aid into two main categories, Donovan. It's merit-based, so that's going to be, you know, academics, and that's going to be need-based. So oftentimes, though, there's a bit of overlap. So you have grants that are derived from both need
Hmm.
and merit. You have some scholarships. So schools will look at scholarship students in terms of merit, but they're also looking in terms of need based. So that's why, and that's another reason, to your point earlier, why it's important to fill out the FAFSA. Students who don't have that filed will cut themselves out of being considered for those need-based scholarships. So that's
Sure.
something you want to consider as well. So again, getting back to your question, you know, generally the items that the student has qualified for will be listed, and then there will be a cost at the bottom, the cost of attendance. So the remaining balance typically that the student and family is responsible for is going to be listed at the bottom. And it's going to be any forms of financial aid that they qualified for, less the cost of tuition and attendance. And that number is typically going to be your balance. Okay. So, and that's, again, that's going to look different for everybody. Some students might qualify for the kitchen sink, and they might have a negative balance, which means that in that case, their financial aid is covering their entire cost of attendance, which is a really beneficial thing for that student.
Hmm.
And other times, students don't qualify for anything. You know, if you
Yeah.
have a student that whose family is so exorbitantly low need, again, your parents are making way too much money. They're beyond that threshold that the government or the college deems is you know, necessary to provide support, and you don't want to take student loans, and maybe your grades weren't that strong. You really, you know, you were an okay student, but you weren't, you know, you weren't setting the world on fire, right?
Yeah.
You didn't qualify for any financial aid, so that's possible too, in which case, you know, your financial aid, I've seen financial aid packages that literally are $0. And you know, so I want to let people know that exists too. But again, it's very situational. And if there's any takeaway message that I would like everybody to know here, it's that there's rarely, if ever, a one size fits all approach.
Yeah, so you're talking about, potentially the aid really covering everything, and you've got kind of money left over when it comes to some of
Yeah, in some
the loans,
instances,
the
students
grants,
get a
things like
refund.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so getting a refund really has me thinking about something else now. So not just is there kind of the tuition, the room and board, the things that you'll see, but like what are other expenses that students should kind of think about that wouldn't be listed on there that, that they could use that money for, or the opposite where you still don't have enough, but it's like you also have to factor in what other expenses as it just relates to being a college student.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's so much more now than I feel like ever. We talked a little bit about students that are driving themselves and students that are providing even housing and transportation on their own. So there's a lot that goes into that. So obviously, anything that's associated with housing, living, cost of living, books, course materials, that has to be up there as far as,
Books, the
if
expensive
not the
calculators.
shoot, right. Or, those, oh gosh, what were they? The
The
TI,
Texas Instrument, yeah.
the T98s or the
Yeah.
T, and I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, but it was, yeah, the Texas, when those first came out, that first generation was something like $300. Those
Yeah.
graphing calculators, remember
Yeah.
those?
I
That
remember
all my
buying a
friends that
calculator that was more than some of my books, and I'm like,
than the
ah,
textbook,
that hurt.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So there's that. There's and course materials, to that point, so much less traditional, so a lot of materials now are offered online and you don't get a traditional textbook, you'll
Yeah.
get a code. Basically, you purchase the code, the access code, and you view all your materials online.
Yeah.
Everything is basically it's downloadable, right? Um, there are some, if you're, so for instance, if you're, you know, you're, um, you're a nursing student or you're an engineer, there might be certain tests or certain certifications that are built into your program. So those are things that you might not necessarily know about, but the university does. And so those are going to be fees that you're not necessarily hidden, but you'll probably be surprised to see on
Hmm.
your bill if you're not looking for them. So again,
Hmm.
going back to the whole ask the questions, talk to people kind of guidance earlier. Yeah, I mean you want to definitely find out what those hidden costs are. Um,
Yeah, you talk about nursing, and I'm thinking about, as they get further along, they're buying scrubs for their clinicals, or you've got an art student who's
yeah.
buying, a canvas. You've got, you're taking um, a physical education class, or you've got to buy a yoga mat. Like there are all these other things that, when it comes to just course materials alone, depending on the type of course, could drastically depend on, is it just a book or is it all of these other things that, you might need to, you need to think about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So if a student is, they've got multiple financial aid offers, or they're trying to compare one school over a different school, what should students really be looking at to compare the actual cost and the actual aid? Because I feel like a lot of the time they get this and they're only focusing on how much money they may be getting. But what
Oh gosh. Yeah. This is this is a drum that I beat all year round because it
Uh-huh.
is so important. And I'm gonna say this, and I know it's coming from my own experiences, so there's a
Sure.
little bit of that implicit bias there, but um yeah, students get those big scholarships from schools, and oftentimes they're from private institutions that have
Yeah.
larger endowments than public kinds, and they equate that scholarship with their worth. And
Hmm.
oftentimes they do it at the exclusion of um, competing schools and other institutions. I'll give you a really good example. And Donovan, I've worked for both public schools and I've worked for private schools. So
Hmm.
having the benefit of seeing the awarding process in both ways, I think provide a not a unique, but I could definitely tell you what it is and what it isn't. So a lot of times the private schools, they'll have a higher tuition point. They'll cost more. They'll do a practice called tuition discounting. And tuition discounting is essentially getting the cost down to a point where um, you don't have as much sticker shock. Which begs the question, why do you make the price so high
Hmm.
to begin with if you know
Correct.
that, student asks if you're going to lower it and you just take off several $1,000s and just like that. So we won't get into the I guess the deeper dive into the
Yeah.
pros and the cons of tuition discounting. Other than that, yes, it exists and it's a very real thing. And oftentimes students will see that $20,000 scholarship from school A, um, and they will see a very smaller or relatively smaller scholarship from school B, and they'll think that school A values me more, that
Hmm.
I'm worth more, and they'll tie that monetary scholarship to their worth, their self-worth, which is terrible thing to do.
Yeah.
Um, but I can't really tell students not to do that because I did the exact same thing, because it's really hard as a human, right? Not to say somebody's giving me this. It's a big number. That's a reward. I'm good. I deserve that. Right.
Uh-huh.
That's human nature. And that was a huge part for me when I was going through the college search. And I was applying, and a lot of the private schools were giving these large scholarships that, hey, we want you to come here, and the public schools that I applied to
Hmm.
weren't, where they were giving significantly less. The thing you have to consider as an educated consumer, right, is the perceived versus actual cost. Uh,
Yes.
what is that college really cost? And so, for instance, if school A costs $40,000 a year, okay, and they give you a $20,000 scholarship, that's wonderful.
Hmm.
You're still financing $20,000 a year, right? If I'm doing my math correctly,
Yeah.
right? We're using simple numbers, so I'm thinking I'm
Yeah.
good on this one. If school B, okay, costs $18,000 a year, they give you a $2,000 scholarship, significantly smaller, $18,000 less than school A was giving you. Which is the better option? Well, a lot of
Yeah.
the students think school A because, hey, they're giving me a $20,000 scholarship, not thinking that school B as my second option is still a full $20,000 less to start with, or 22, however, whatever I
Hmm.
made this example. And so that $2,000 scholarship is still it's reducing your cost even more. So I think that that's something that if I were to say a message that I really want to just hammer home, and for our listeners out there to understand, it's that um, don't always, and there are some wonderful private schools out there, Donovan, and
Hmm.
this is not an indictment on the prior private sector. But oftentimes your value is good at better at a public school, or
Yeah.
a 4-year public institution or a 2-year public institution, community college. There are some really, really great ways to get an amazing education, to pick up phenomenal knowledge and skills without going into a massive amount of debt.
Hmm.
So that's something that I think is really, really important for people to know. Something else to consider is okay, let's go back to that private school versus public school
Yeah.
example. That larger scholarship from the public school, or the private school, excuse me, is that for a single year? Is that spread over 4 years? Is it spread over 2 years?
Yeah. I gotta ask those
What
questions.
right? What are the
Yeah.
terms of renewing that? Do I have to um maintain a certain GPA? Do I have to, if it's um physical community service or an athletic based scholarship, do I
Hmm.
have to meet certain criteria in order to remain eligible? So that's something that you want to think about too, is that scholarship that is huge. That I was working with a student last year. There's a true story. I'll keep the institutions anonymous and I'll change the numbers, but the concept is the same. Student got $80,000 from one of our private schools that's in the area.
Hmm.
Um, that's spread out over 4 years.
Hmm.
It's still a lot of money to say that a school is going to hand me a check of what did I say, 20,000, $80,000. So
Yeah,
$20,000 of the course, right? But if that school is some astronomical number, like if it's going to cost you 200 grand to go there and get a degree from,
correct.
you see where I'm going with this? Like you're still paying awful
Yeah,
lot of money.
yeah. It looks the
Even though
80,000, the
that's
80K looks nice, and when you're looking
yeah,
at it, but
that's
yeah.
yeah, it's a big number on paper. It gives me all the warm fuzzies, and mom and dad are super proud of me, and I get that. But at the end of the day, how many thousands of dollars did I go and pay? Yeah.
Hmm.
So and obviously there are other factors that go into to it too. And financial pieces or financial component is a huge piece of it, right? But there are other things too. There's fit, right? Does the school have my major? Like if you're going for a very specific major that is only offered at three schools in your state, then I guess
Yeah.
and you really want that, then you're going to one of those three schools and it stands to reason. But what are my other what are the other things that I'm considering and fit,
Hmm.
and that's certainly a big thing. But do I like going there? Is the weather,
Hmm.
could I see myself, going here? Am I going to be comfortable with the people, the climate, the culture? Can I play a sport? Can I be involved in 17 different clubs and organizations, or am I totally equally comfortable in anonymity? So it's just, it's all of these things that kind of go into figuring out that fit. But yeah, just know what your costs are.
Yeah. I would say I was in front of about 300 or 400 students this past summer, and literally I was giving the same type of analogy, and I was talking about the private schools and how I'm like, they're like so, and I had a really good dialogue with a couple students in a group, and I was like, in our reality, it's kind of marketing. I'm like, when you look at how much they're giving you, I'm like, the school, you
Yeah,
get a scholarship from University A, and it's a university scholarship. So not something
yeah,
that someone has donated money to give you or something like that. But like, if it's a university scholarship, the university's not paying themselves. They're just
right.
making your tuition lower. They're not giving you money that
Yes,
didn't give themselves money. I'm like,
yeah,
you gotta like pay attention to that, but look literally at how much you have to pay because
yeah,
you will get that $20,000 scholarship, like you were saying, but then students will call too, as you know, and they're like, "Hey, well, this school just gave me this. Can you match this?" And if you're that University
yeah,
B, that public institution where your tuition is 18,000, it's like, no, I can't match it because that's more than we're even
yeah.
charging you for tuition. So
100%.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think it's important as higher education professionals to be on various sides of that conversation.
uh-huh,
Because it does give you that appreciation, and it does give you that moment to kind of say, okay, well, and hopefully that student and that family is receptive. And I would say most times they are. You sit down and you have a conversation with them, and you could break down the numbers, and then you can see them arrive at that conclusion, which is the best case scenario. uh, and then at least having understood that, then they can make a decision. And if they really, you say, okay, well, no matter what, you have the information you need um, to guide your thought process. If you really want to go to school A that is giving you the scholarship, and you know what it's going to cost, hey,
hmm,
at least it's apples to apples, and you know what that entails.
sure,
But it's yeah, oh man, you want to talk about stuff that keeps me up at night or just makes me feel, no, it's really too, and especially
yeah,
working for a public school now in a
hmm,
an area of the country that's so saturated with
yeah,
options, with
yeah,
college options.
so
A
many,
lot of those being private schools that have no qualms about, dropping those large scholarships. Yeah, I wish I had more time in the day to have conversations with students about what's the best fit for them financially, and
yeah,
not just what's the most impressive letter that they get in the mail.
hmm,
Um,
sure. So that's going to be a wrap for episode one. So much action-packed information into that one episode. So much great information shared by Nick. But we're going to cut it there for episode one. There's a lot more information in part two that I feel that you'll find valuable. So stay tuned and give us a like, subscribe, but stay tuned for episode two.
Welcome to Untapped Knowledge for College, presented by the College Knowledge Foundation. Join us as we untap the world of college admissions, financial aid, and student life through collective wisdom and engaging conversations.